There is a specific kind of person who has spent most of their life being misread. They leave gatherings early, not because something went wrong, but because something was finished. They don't fill silence in conversations. They take longer than others to respond to messages, not out of indifference, but because the response they're composing is the one they actually mean. They have been described at various points as distant, difficult, too much inside their own head. And what almost no one around them understands is that the solitude isn't a symptom, it's a practice. Nietzsche saw this clearly at a time when almost no philosophical tradition had the vocabulary to name it. In Beyond Good and Evil, published in 1886, he wrote that the higher type of human being, the person engaged in genuine self-development, requires solitude not as retreat from life, but as the very condition that makes a real life possible. He was not romanticizing isolation. He was making a precise psychological claim that certain kinds of thinking, certain kinds of becoming, cannot happen inside the continuous noise of social performance. What he was describing, more than a century before the neuroscience existed to confirm it, was something researchers would eventually identify as one of the most important cognitive systems in the human brain. If that already feels like something you've lived but never had language for, give this video a like right now. Because what follows is going to reframe something most people have spent years apologizing for. 1. The brain that goes quiet in company isn't broken, it's working. In 2001, neuroscientist Marcus Raichle at Washington University made a discovery that changed how researchers understood the resting brain. Scanning subjects who were not engaged in any specific task, he found something unexpected. The brain didn't go quiet when left alone. It became more active, but in a different network than the one used for focused external tasks. He called it the default mode network. And what it does, when given uninterrupted space, is extraordinary. It consolidates memory, processes complex emotional experience, generates creative connections between unrelated concepts, constructs models of other people's minds, and builds the kind of integrated self-understanding that cannot be assembled during active social engagement. The default mode network, in other words, is where the most sophisticated cognitive work happens, and it requires one specific condition to function: the absence of external demand. This is what certain people are protecting when they choose solitude. Not comfort, not avoidance. A neurological environment in which the processing that matters most to them can actually occur. When you force someone with a highly active default mode network into continuous social stimulation, you're not helping them connect. You're interrupting work they cannot explain to you because the work is happening below the threshold of language. Nietzsche had no access to neuroimaging, but his description of the solitary thinker, someone who needs long stretches of uninterrupted interiority to produce anything worth producing, maps onto what Rachel's research eventually confirmed with precision that philosophy alone couldn't provide. 2. Nietzsche's diagnosis of what social performance actually costs. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche constructed one of his most sustained metaphors around the figure of Zarathustra descending from the mountain, not fleeing society, but returning to it only after having first been genuinely alone. The solitude was not the destination. It was the preparation, the thing that made the descent meaningful rather than merely habitual. What he was pointing at was something he developed more explicitly in Beyond Good and Evil: the distinction between what he called the herd and the higher type. Not a moral distinction, a psychological one. The herd, as Nietzsche used the term, describes people whose identity is constituted primarily through social mirroring. Who they are depends continuously on the reflection they receive from others, on belonging, on the maintenance of consensus and approval. Remove the audience and the self becomes unstable. The higher type, by contrast, has developed what Nietzsche called a center of gravity that is internal rather than social. Their sense of who they are does not require continuous external confirmation, which means they can be alone. Genuinely alone, not just physically separated from others while remaining mentally preoccupied with what those others think, without experiencing the aloneness as a crisis. What social performance costs the person with this kind of internal structure is not trivial. Every interaction that requires the management of presentation, the calibration of what to reveal, what to suppress, how to position each sentence for the specific audience receiving it, draws from a resource that is limited and that replenishes primarily in solitude. For some people, this cost is low and the replenishment is fast. For others, the ratio runs the other direction. The cost is high and the recovery is slow. Calling the second group antisocial misses what is actually happening. They are not failing at connection. They are expensive processors in a world that was designed for cheaper ones. 3. What solitude-seeking people are actually doing with the time. There is a persistent cultural assumption that time spent alone is time spent in the absence of something. Connection, productivity, engagement with the world. Nietzsche's entire philosophical project is an argument against this assumption. His most generative periods were characterized by sustained solitude. In Sils Maria, in the Swiss Alps, walking for hours in conditions most people would describe as isolation. What was happening in that isolation was not nothing. Psychologist Esther Buchholz at New York University spent years documenting what she called the alone time need, a developmental requirement present from infancy and persisting throughout life, for periods of genuine solitude that are distinct from sleep and distinct from passive rest. Her research suggested that the capacity to be productively alone, to use solitude as a creative and integrative resource rather than simply enduring it, is one of the most reliable markers of psychological maturity. What people with a high alone time need are typically doing in their solitude is processing, not in the therapeutic sense necessarily, but in the computational one. They are integrating experience, testing ideas against each other without the distortion that social pressure introduces, arriving at positions that are actually theirs rather than negotiated versions of what the room seemed to want from them. Susan Cain's research into introversion, documented extensively in her 2012 work, Quiet, found that people who function best with high amounts of solitude tend to produce qualitatively different output than those who generate their best thinking in social contexts. Not better necessarily, but more internally consistent, more fully developed, less dependent on external validation to maintain its structure. The thinking has been done in private, which means it arrives in public already load-bearing. Nietzsche would have recognized this immediately. In Ecce Homo, describing his own working method, he wrote about the necessity of long walks alone, not as recreation, but as the specific condition under which his thinking could move without obstruction. The solitude was not where he went when the work was done. It was where the work happened. Think about the last time you had a genuinely uninterrupted stretch of time alone. No obligations, no performance, no one to manage. What happened in you during that time? Comment below. Solitude is where I find myself. Just that, because the people who recognize this in themselves almost never say it out loud. 4. Why intelligent people find most conversation genuinely exhausting. This requires a precision that the usual framing of introversion versus extroversion doesn't quite provide. The exhaustion isn't about people in general. It's about a specific feature of most social interaction, the requirement to operate at the level of the exchangeable, to participate in conversations whose primary function is maintenance rather than exploration. The continuous, low-stakes affirmation of shared norms, shared humor, shared mild opinion. The social equivalent of keeping the lights on. For people whose minds habitually operate at a different register, who are most alive when thinking moves somewhere it hasn't been before. This kind of conversation doesn't rest them, It drains them in a particular way, not the depletion of having given something, but the frustration of having been unable to give what they actually have. Nietzsche named this dynamic directly. In Beyond Good and Evil, he described the experience of depth confronting surfaces, the specific loneliness of someone who thinks in ways that have no natural interlocutor in their immediate environment. Not arrogance. Isolation, the recognition that what you are most interested in discussing has no place in most available conversations, and that participating in those conversations requires a sustained performance of shallower engagement than you actually contain. Hans Eysenk's research on cortical arousal established a physiological basis for this differential. Introverts, he found, have a characteristically higher baseline level of cortical arousal than extroverts, meaning they reach overstimulation faster in high-input social environments and require less external stimulation to reach their optimal functional state. The preference for solitude is not a choice made against connection. It is a nervous system doing what nervous systems do, seeking the conditions under which it functions best. The misreading of this as coldness, as superiority, as difficulty, is one of the more persistent errors that socially dominant norms produce. The person leaving the party early is not rejecting you. They are protecting a resource that the party is consuming faster than it can be replaced. This channel exists outside the algorithm. No sponsorships, no brand deals, just research, writing, and the belief that ideas sharp enough to change how you see yourself are worth protecting. If this is giving you language for something you felt for years without being able to name, consider supporting this work directly through the link in the description. Every contribution keeps this independent, and independence is exactly what allows this kind of honesty. 5. What Nietzsche actually warned about: the solitude that destroys rather than builds. Because this is where the conversation has to become more honest than it usually gets. There is a solitude that is productive, generative, integrative, chosen from a position of genuine self-possession. And there is a solitude that is reactive, a withdrawal driven not by the need to think, but by the fear of being seen, not by the richness of inner life, but by its poverty, not by strength, but by the accumulated damage of enough exposure to feel like a permanent condition. Nietzsche was unsparing about the difference. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Zarathustra does not remain on the mountain. He descends. Repeatedly, the solitude has a function. It is where he becomes something worth bringing back. But the descent is the point. The gift moves outward. The thinking finds contact. If it never does, if the solitude becomes permanent, self-reinforcing, defended against any real encounter, then what looked like strength has quietly become its opposite. The Stoic philosophers, whose work Nietzsche engaged with throughout his life, made a related distinction. Marcus Aurelius, in his Meditations, wrote about the discipline of returning to yourself not as a permanent residence, but as a practice. Something you do so that you can then do everything else more clearly. The solitude is a method, not a destination. Used well, it produces someone more capable of genuine presence. Used as escape, it produces someone increasingly incapable of it. The warning Nietzsche would actually deliver to the person who identifies with intelligent solitude is this: make sure the aloneness is making you more, not less. Make sure the thinking that happens there is finding some form of expression, some point of contact with the world, some way of becoming useful beyond the interior where it was formed. Because a philosophy of solitude that ends in solitude is not a philosophy. It is a symptom dressed as a preference. Now, the honest part. There are two kinds of people who have stayed with this conversation to the end. The first is someone who recognized themselves in what was described, who has spent years being misread as cold or distant or difficult, when what was actually happening was something more like this: an internal life so active that the external one rarely keeps pace. If that's you, the thing worth taking from this is not validation. It's the distinction between solitude as practice and solitude as protection. One of them makes you more, the other keeps you smaller than you actually are. The second kind of person in this conversation is someone who has someone like this in their life, their partner, a friend, a child, and has been taking the withdrawal personally in ways that have made the relationship harder than it needs to be. The person who needs to be alone is not leaving you. They are doing the one thing that makes them capable of genuinely arriving. The worst response to that need is to make it a source of conflict. The best response is to understand it clearly enough that you stop requiring them to apologize for it. Nietzsche's deepest philosophical project was not the celebration of isolation. It was the argument for authenticity, for the life that is actually yours rather than the one assembled from what your environment expected of you. Solitude, in his framework, is not the end of that project. It is the space in which the project becomes possible at all. What's yours? Are you someone who has been apologizing for needing solitude? Or someone who has been misreading another person's need for it as something about you? Leave it in the comments, and be specific if you can. The most valuable conversations here are the ones where people say what they actually mean. If this is the kind of examination you want more of, the patient, honest, unflinching look at what actually drives human behavior and what philosophy has to say about it, subscribe, because the next video takes this further in a direction that will be uncomfortable for different reasons. The people who know themselves most clearly are almost always the ones who spent the most time alone with the question,